Everybody to 52 Living Ideas. Today is Comprehensivist Wednesday that we do in collaboration with the Greater Philadelphia Thinking Society. I'm delighted to have my friend Phil back, and we're going to be talking about language, specifically the work of Owen Barfield. It is incredibly deep work. So what we're going to do is that we're going to make it interactive. Phil has a presentation, and I'm going to keep on adding, having a conversation with Phil with every point he makes. And at some point, I'm going to get everybody else in as well to talk. So so have your questions ready, and we can get started. All right, Phil.
All right, here we go. Take two. I was going to say we're going to start out with the blank slate of John Locke, but it turns out that underneath that there's the Freudian subconscious. So anyway, here we go. So you should see a black screen, hopefully with no more naughty drawings. And what I'm going to do is, as we talk, I will add my notes to this. One second. Sorry about that. 1 second. To the screen. So here we go. So last time, I want to just do a quick review because it's been some time and there's some new people that haven't heard this this talk from previous time. Last time we talked about this idea that Owen Barfield has put forth about language, in particular, the history of meaning in language and words, specific words, that showcases a history of consciousness. So, and the idea being, oops, what's going on here? Sorry, it looks like I am. You know what? Unfortunately, I'm having some technical issues here. Sorry about that. Let me stop the sharing. We're having some issues. Let me just talk then. I'll try to reproduce what I wanted to say without the screen. Unfortunately, it looks like my notes got mangled here in the process. So what we were talking about last time is this idea that if you look at language and if you look at words, individual words and their meanings and how they change, you're doing something very similar to what a paleontologist is doing when he unearths fossils and starts recreating life as it existed at some point, some time ago, right? And words are essentially crystallized consciousness. Their meanings are very fluid and they change, and we can observe that change, and it helps us in some ways to get in touch with a consciousness that is no longer active. And the way this has surfaced for Barfield and for many others is through something he calls aesthetic imagination. Now, aesthetic imagination is an experience of felt change in consciousness that one experiences when reading a poem, reading some work of art, work of literature, and there is like a current, a connection, and that connection actually, a side effect of that is pleasure, some experience of pleasure that, and Barfield describes it in his book Poetic Diction, that is in fact what alerted him to this phenomena. He was reading poetry from Homeric poetry, Latin poetry, etc., and he realized that he was having these vivid, very poignant moments of experience in this reading, and he started digging deeper, and that's when he realized that he was in fact reliving a consciousness that was no longer with us today, and this process of reliving is what triggered him to start digging deeper into what is going on. So that was, something we talked about last time, and we talked about how it, obviously poetry, you cannot study poetry without studying language. You cannot study language without studying words, and then words themselves have, different meanings. And the next step we took after that was to say, okay, well, how does poetry, how does it do it? What is this magic? What's the operative modus operandi of this? And
Phil, whenever you finished a point, just ask me and I will have.
Okay. Well, we can stop here. I guess the point of departure for this is going to be metaphor, but we can stop here because this is a good point, and maybe we can have a quick discussion on that.
Sure. So I really love this idea of paleontology or archaeology. Think of the Grand Canyon. Also think of the human brain itself. Okay, human brain, there is the oldest part is down here at the back, and then there are layers on the top, layers on the top, layers on the top. And if you want to really understand the brain, you have to go through all the layers and see which layers, they actually work together. And you never know which layer is operating at what point and where the operation came from. Similarly, in Grand Canyon, you can see this entire range of things that have happened over time. Now, the beautiful thing about language is that all those layers are operative in you. All the words that you're using have a certain history, and they have all passed through multiple iterations for them to show up today. Now, when you look at something in the past, like we've been looking at Tao Te Ching, Gospel of John. Let's take Gospel of John as an example because it is in English. You can see the way in which words are used at that time is different. So it is like digging up to a level and trying to figure out what life forms lived there and what was their nature. So you are actually you're able to see and guess what life forms lived there. So just like a paleontologist goes to a deeper layer in Grand Canyon and figures out, oh, these were the creatures that were alive at that time, and then tries to figure out what their lives was like. When you look at language of the past, if you do the work, you can actually see a different kind of consciousness operative. This is true in time, but it is also true in space. When you look at language from a very different culture, you have the same kind of an experience. And that is something incredible about language. Now, this is just a fact about language. And that was the first point that Phil made. The second point that Phil made was that when you notice that your mind is operating differently, when you see something in, let's say, Gospel of John, and a phrase hits you, it is recreating that consciousness that actually produces that language in the first place. So it's a way of reanimating that consciousness in your brain, making it live in your brain. And the experience is what he calls felt change of consciousness, because you are tapping into the consciousness that used it for the first time. You're seeing life through their eyes and through their minds by the grace of the language of that time. Phil, if you would like to comment on anything, I say you're welcome to do that, or you can go to the next point whenever you want.
Yeah, this was great, Shrikant. So yeah, this idea that the words trigger, reanimate essentially the consciousness, that's the main point, I think. And poetry is really unique in this sense, and literature in general. And then, of course, as we dig deeper, we start seeing, okay, what are the instruments of that? And that's when it becomes really interesting, because now we're getting into the details of this. Before I move on, I just want to make one quick point about consciousness. We typically don't think much about it because really no one knows what it is. But one way to think about it, which is kind of simplistic but still accurate, is its awareness. So when we talk about a felt change in consciousness, that means it's a felt change in our awareness of our environment. And that environment includes both things that are on the outside and things that are on the inside. It's a felt change in our awareness of the outside world and of the inner world. All of a sudden, we might be aware of something inside of us that we weren't aware of before. All of a sudden, we might be aware of a different way to look at the world on the outside. And I want to bring that point in just a second here. That kind of goes with this word meanings and consciousness. So awareness of the world, that's what consciousness is. The other thing that I want to highlight is the fact that Barfield calls it aesthetic imagination. Now, imagination, we typically think of imagination as something that poets use. We don't think of ourselves employing imagination. And Barfield makes this really interesting point. And again, a lot of the stuff he said is controversial. It's interesting because it's controversial. You may not agree with what he says, but it definitely makes you think about it. And my sort of barometer for what he says is, do I actually, is it interesting and do I like it? Do I like how it feels when he says certain things? So he says that imagination is required not only for poets to create whatever they create, but it is required for us to create the world every day. Every day when we receive data from the outside world, this data is organized and interpreted by us through imagination. We have this imaginative organ that is functioning all the time. And if it wasn't there, it would be a cacophony of sounds, cacophony of colors, cacophony of sensory impressions that are disordered. The only reason why we look out and we see a sky, a mountain, this and that, is because in our minds, the lines, the shapes, etc., is organized by some organizing principle. And that principle is what he calls imagination. Poets use the imagination to create things that don't even exist on the outside, right? They use imagination to create fictional stories, etc. But we use imagination every day. And this is where it becomes, again, it's connecting our everyday experience to this idea of poetry and art. And this is, I find this fascinating because to me, what's missing in our lives today is this connection. We're very technological, we're very pragmatic, we're very, oriented on results and this and that, but art seems to be a purview of the few, unfortunately. And it's Barfield makes these statements that actually open art and imagination and aesthetics to everyone. And to me, that's one of the values, I guess, of discussing these things, because it puts us on the same level playing field with great poets. So let me drag this point about imagination here as well, so we don't forget about it. And he uses this distinction he calls primary imagination, what we do every day. Secondary is what poets do. So this is kind of all connected, right? So the experience of poetry, he calls it aesthetic imagination, felt change in consciousness. Consciousness is awareness of the world, outer and inner. And then this imagination part, that's actually connected to our perception of the world. So there's a lot here. I want to stop. Maybe Shrikant, I don't know if you want to make any comments.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Can you stop sharing the screen?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. All right, folks. So this point about imagination is a very deep point. We can understand it in two different ways. First point is that mind is not a passive receptor. People implicitly are thinking that the concepts are simply the way in which you take in information. No, it is you take in the information, then you project what the world is like. Jordan Peterson makes the distinction between two fundamentally different ways of looking at the world. One as world as a place of things, and second, world as a forum for action. Owen Barfield is in the tradition of world as a forum for action. And what the mind is doing is not simply trying to take in, it is guiding action. It is taking in what it is seeing, and then it is projecting what you should be doing. What is it? Like, I think the person who does a fantastic job of describing this is Julian Jaynes. He says consciousness is mental space where you take input from the physical world, and then you game out what are the possible things you could do. And that action of imagining possible courses of action for you, what will happen in each of those cases is an act of imagination that we use in order to guide our life. So this is daily imagination. It is an integral part of how the mind works. Imagination is not this unusual thing that we use some of the time. This is something that we use all of the time. You always, and our brain uses this mechanism a lot, not even at a preconceptual level. You have some data and it immediately extrapolates things from that to say what it could be. And it uses it as a guide for action. So first point is that it is a loop from physical world inside and inner world outside. It is as a guide for action. Another way of saying it is that it's a question of participation. We are not spectators in the world. We are participants in the drama of the world. And we create the world, we transform the world through our action. And use of our mind, use of our language is the tool with which we do this. So all the aspects that we are noticing about the mind comes from the requirement of action. So in this sense, imagination is what we do. This is a core part of who we are as human beings. Phil.
Okay, so let me go back to my slide here. Okay. All right, so so we talked, Barfield noticed that poetry was, had this effect on him, and he started digging deeper, and that led him to study of words and their meanings and how those meanings have changed. And we'll return to that. But the next big observation is that poetry operates through metaphor. Metaphor is the big one in poetry. And so I'm going to make this point here on the canvas. Metaphor. Okay, so what are metaphors? The literal, if we look at the word again, metaphor, it's a Greek word which means to carry over or carry beyond, right? Which again is interesting, right? It's like you have something, but you carry it beyond its original meaning, right? A metaphor. And what are these metaphors? And what's the how do they arrive? And so the next, Barfield, he spends a lot of time discussing different theories of origin for metaphors, and then he kind of discounts them. He's not satisfied with, this was written, of course, 50 or 60 years ago, but I don't think much has changed in terms of theories of how metaphors originated. Basically, no one really knows for sure. There are lots of theories, and they are not terribly satisfying because they seem to be missing an important link between art and meaning. And that's where, you know, he comes in and says, okay, we have to think differently about this. Of course, last time we talked about, I think it was David who made this point that all language today is metaphors, right? All of our words are metaphors, and I agree with that. I think if we look at any of the words that we use today, most of them go back to something that was originally a sensible object. You know, all of our abstract concepts are based on things that are material. You know, matter goes back to mother. All of our terms in physics and chemistry, they all go back to something very sensible, something we can tangible, something we can touch and feel. But today, when we talk about anything, right, we don't experience the felt change in consciousness, right? We're not always transformed when we talk to one another. So why is that? Well, the reason for that is these metaphors, they are ossified. They're like bones that point to something, but they're not actually operative. So when we exchange words in a conversation, typically we don't have this current, we don't have this change from one plane to another, because all the meaning has been ossified and we're no longer trading in this living metaphors. The metaphors have been solidified, crystallized, and they're kind of buried halfway. So what poetry does is it pours water on these bones or creates new ones and recreates the links that metaphors originally were supposed to embody. So that's the function of metaphors in poetry. It creates these links, it carries the meaning beyond from one place to another. It makes these connections that make poetry pleasant to read. When we read poetry, and I drank up heaven, or some kind of expression like that all of a sudden we think, wow, that's interesting. I never thought you could drink up heaven, or something symbolic like that. That creates this current, this felt change in consciousness. So that's the operative function of metaphors. Okay, I think we can probably, I don't know, Shrikant, you want to?
Sure. Okay, look, this concept of metaphors is the deepest concept I know on language. Metaphor, do not think of metaphors as a poetic device. They are far, far more fundamental than that. It's just that poetry uses their power explicitly to create something new. Metaphors are simply using something that you are more familiar with to think about something that you are less familiar with. I strongly recommend the work of George Lakoff, Metaphors We Live By, which does a fantastic job of showing how physical metaphors are what Julian Jaynes called metaphors, the things that we are more familiar with, that we are going to use as tools to deal with something that you're less familiar with. Lakoff makes the point that it's metaphors all the way down. Let me give you an example. He talks about orientation metaphors. So up and down, just up and down. Okay, that's it. There is up and there is down that we have from the way our bodies are, the way we can look up and we can look down. This is something which is physical. Now see the extent to which this has shaped our language and our thought. Happy is up, sad is down. I'm feeling up. That boosted my spirits. My spirit rose. You're in high spirits. Thinking about her always gives me a lift. I'm feeling down. I'm depressed. He's really low these days. I fell into a depression. My spirit sank. The physical basis of it is drooping posture. So there is a connecting this, the emotion and the up and down. The middle term is the drooping posture, typically goes along with sadness, depression, and erect posture with a positive emotional state. Let's take another one. Consciousness is up, unconscious is down. Get up, wake up. I'm up already. He rises early in the morning. He fell asleep. He dropped off to sleep. He's under hypnosis. He sank under a coma, into a coma. Health and life are up. Sickness and death are down. He's at the peak of his health. Lazarus rose from the dead. He's in top shape. As to his health, he's way up there. He fell ill. He's sinking fast. He came down with a flu. His health is declining. He dropped dead. Having control and force is up. Having power is up. And being subject to control or force is down. I have control over her. I am on top of the situation. He's in a superior position. He's at the height of his power. He's in high command. He's in the upper echelons. His power rose. He's under my control. He fell from power. His power is on decline. He's my social inferior. He's a low man on the totem pole. More is up and less is down. The number of books printed each year keeps going up. His draft number is high. My income rose last year. The number of errors he made is incredibly low. His income fell this year. He's underage. If you are too hot, turn the heat down. And it goes on and on. You know, high status is up, virtue is up, depravity is down, good is up, bad is down, rational is up, emotional is down. So basically what is happening here, you can see how fundamental metaphors are to language itself, that we are using up and down to talk about social relations, emotional states, cognition, all kinds of things which are harder to talk about. So this is a huge, huge point. So these metaphors are built into the language. Now, what poets do is that they create new metaphors that allow you to see something. Now, these metaphors have been built over time. That is the archaeology of language that we're talking about. It's the Grand Canyon. You have to go back to say, okay, when did they start using this particular way of talking about this? So point I'm making is that metaphors is the essential tool of language, of expanding the scope of what you can think about by using what you know to think about what you don't know or don't know that well. So expanding that. And what poets do is that they create new metaphors that make you see something that you did not see before. And that is what produces this felt change of consciousness. So think of poets as jumping up in this. Otherwise, the evolution of language is going like this. Most people are using it, and actually they're going a little bit down because they're just using it without adding to it. Whereas poets actually create new metaphors. You can look at people like Shakespeare. The extent to which they added to the language is pretty incredible. So this is a very deep topic. I recommend work of George Lakoff in order to see the pervasiveness of metaphors. The last point I will make about this is about Julian Jaynes. His point is that all concepts of consciousness are rooted in physical concepts. So you observe something outside and use it to refer to something inside. And that is why we can talk about them, because we can go back to the outside as a common reference to refer to something that is inside. So the entire range of concepts of consciousness come from there. So it's a huge, huge topic. We're just barely touching on it today. Go ahead, Phil.
Okay. a couple of points about that. Shrikant, thank you for those examples. Actually, that was great. I was hoping we could come up with something like that, because that's, it showcases the power of metaphor, and also it showcases something else. If you noticed, there was consistent meaning in up and down. It wasn't, it didn't switch. It was consistent. And so as Barfield and others have explored this topic, they've noticed that there's some metaphors that he calls incidental. And they're also fine, and they also have pleasant aesthetic effects, but they don't touch us as deep as what he calls true metaphors. Now, what are true metaphors? Well, to answer that, you have to think about what is, again, the origin, how, what is the evolution of language, and what is the evolution of metaphors? Well, as Barfield showcases and explains in Poetic Diction, philologists and other scientists, when they look back at the history of language, what they find is language becomes more and more poetic the further you go back, which was surprising because, most theories of the origin of language, they kind of postulate that you start with these sort of grunts, and, you go from kind of, that kind of thing too. And all of a sudden, the first examples of anything written we have is amazing. I mean, it's, Homer has never been surpassed. Virgil has never been surpassed. Gilgamesh has never been surpassed. All these, most ancient, or very ancient texts that contain poetry, and they're extremely poetic. And they contain these metaphors. And the question is, how did they arise? And that's the that's the controversial subject that he brings up. What is it? Now, the point that he makes is the following. This is, he says, okay, well, there are some explanations that he calls naturalistic explanation. Okay, so we have people observing some natural phenomenon, they associate it with some divinity, and they say, okay, well, that's, oh, thundered, Zeus thundered, or something like that. Okay, so connection between phenomenon and some sort of divine intervention. We read Homer, you have gods doing all these wonderful things. Okay. Jung comes along, Carl Jung, and he says, no, it's not just naturalistic, it's psychological. They didn't just look out, they looked in, and they found that there is like chaos inside, and so they said, oh, there's a god of chaos, and there's also this struggle between the gods of order, the Apollonian struggle versus Dionysus. So here's, this is where these, this is why these gods are so fundamental, because we have, internally, there's a reflection of that in our soul, not just on the outside. Okay, but Barfield is not satisfied with either of those answers. He says, no, it's actually both of those, and it's something else too. And what he postulates, and this is where, I guess, where the most controversial part of him comes out, is he postulates that the people that originally were talking and writing, to them, these things were not metaphors. They were just describing what they felt. We no longer feel that. When we read it, we're surprised, and it triggers something in us because it's so different from the way we perceive the world. But to them, it was all the same. So when we read in the Gospel of John about the wind and the spirit and the breath, we're like, oh, wow, it's all the same word. That's interesting. But to them, the words were not yet crystallized into separate meanings. They were all the same thing. And they were, he says, the word pneuma, for the Greek word for breath, spirit, and wind, it didn't mean breath, it didn't mean spirit, it didn't mean wind. It meant something that was other than all those things, and yet included in itself all those different manifestations. Now, that's a controversial, interesting point that he makes. I like that point. I don't know if it's true or not, but it's certainly interesting to think about. And that explains why we have such affinity for the ancient texts. They reawaken in us these connections that perhaps are real, but we've lost. And that's why when we reread it and we read about the gods and we read about this and that, there's something there that is not just purely a reflection of the form, maybe there's something about the essence that is interesting. And I'm just going to bring it out there because that's the point that Barfield makes. You can agree or disagree, or you can have maybe some naturalistic explanation for it. But Barfield's explanation is the metaphors are not incidental. The metaphors reflect an underlying reality, and which is why they're stable across all languages, all cultures. And I'll stop here with a little preview of the next point, which is the next step you go from words to metaphors. The next step is myth. And
let me make one more. This is really fascinating, Phil. It's wonderful to be talking about this. So I'll make 2 points here. First point is, like Lakoff talks about like schema of the metaphor. The point that you made is that it's not that when you look at all the examples of this up and down, it's not that things are pointing every which way. There is all pointing in one direction. So there is like the goodness and happiness and wealth and more and consciousness are all in one direction. And the others are in opposite direction. So there are these schemas, and up and down is a very simple schema. You can do the same thing with a building, like a constructed building. There'll be a whole bunch of metaphors connected with it. And all the metaphors are, hang on this idea of building being constructed. This is a foundation, this is the top, this is the middle, we are in the process of building it. And that applies to many, 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 many different fields. So there is a structure to these metaphors. And there is a concept of true metaphor where the metaphor actually helps you understand nature of something better than you did before the metaphor. The second point I want to make, and this is where I want to bring in Marshall McLuhan. See, we are on Comprehensivist Wednesdays, so we have to bring in all these people. So we have studied the work of Walter Ong and Marshall McLuhan, and we have had presentations by the Center for the Study of Digital Life on different sensibilities as they move. So for example, in the oral culture, the way language was, the way the consciousness was different. I like the word sensibility. This oral sensibility is very different from the sensibility in the scribal age, where people began to write, but the writing was very precious and all kinds of conversation surrounded every book. And there was a back and forth between speech and writing, the kind of sensibility. For example, all the works that we've been studying, like Gospel of John, Tao Te Ching, and Bhagavad Gita, are from this scribal age. Then you come to print age, where the printed word is separated out from this oral envelope, and it operates very differently in us. And then we move to the television age, where it operates completely differently than a book or the scribes or the oral culture. And now we are in the digital age, which is something else. So the way in which we engage with language and engage with people using the language shapes the language. So when you look back at somebody from the oral tradition, the way they're using their mind is different. And that is what you're noticing. And it may seem, that's the point I wanted to make, that the sensibilities change over time with technology, with the way in which we engage each other. Thank you, Phil. Go on, please.
Okay, let me go back to my slide here. Yeah. All right, so I'm gonna just show where we are so far. Okay, and then the point that I was trying to make was the metaphors are neither accidental nor premeditated. They're just expressions of some underlying reality. And then Barfield talks about the different theories about how they emerged. And so we have like the naturalistic explanation that metaphors are just observations about natural world, or they're observations about the inner world. And he proposes there's some sort of synthesis that actually is not just physical, not just sort of psychic, but kind of a connection of something else, or that includes all of those things. And the example that he uses is this concept of three words, right? Three different concepts today: death, sleep, and winter. Now, we think of them as completely different, right? They have completely different meaning, not related words necessarily, but the concepts are unified when you go back. And when you go back to myth, these concepts are actually connected. And there's something about that connection that, I don't know, again, you can't explain it rationally. It's some kind of intuition. And he says you can't create meaning just by reasoning your way into it, because ultimately, if you start explaining the words, like, what does this mean? What does that mean? You end up with tautologies, right? Saying the same thing. If you go to a dictionary, the dictionary is going to define A in terms of B, B in terms of C, C in terms of D, and then eventually you make the full circle. So how do you create meaning? I mean, if it's all just tautological. Well, he says the only way you can create meaning is by artistic expression of these words. It's not just saying A equals B equals C equals D, because that will never work. It's putting these things together and creating links and expressing them that creates actual meaning. So going back to the metaphor and the myth is one step further from metaphor. It's like a story now. So it's not just a connection, it's actually a story about this connection. Of course, the connection with death and sleep and winter is the myth of Persephone, right? Persephone was taken from her mother, Demeter, and there was the story of death, and winter came because Demeter refused to appear. And I mean, there's just all these connections. Of course, we have all kinds of fairy tales where sleep and death are equated, right? The princess, and she falls asleep and she's really not dead, but she is kind of dead. I mean, there's all kinds of folklore associated with these concepts, all kinds of myths, and they're very stable again. There's somebody can say, well, people just observe similarities. But again, Barfield is not satisfied with this. And he says, no, these people just express what was obvious to them, that these things are kind of related or the same. Let me put this last point about kind of a progression from words to metaphors to myth. And maybe, I don't know if you want to say a few words here, Shrikant.
Yes, I mean, I think Carl Jung's work, again, this is Comprehensivist Wednesdays, so I'm trying to connect up many of the things that we've done. Carl Jung's work of looking at myths of multiple cultures and trying to see what is common to them is very powerful, because it is trying to get at something that is universal. And the point that Phil made, that myth is a story. Story is a very powerful metaphor, very powerful metaphor. The best illustration of that we have studied is Jordan Peterson's book, Maps of Meaning, and being able to map all the stories and all the progressions of life in that. So thank you. Please go on, Phil.
Okay. So, just wanted to make another final point about meaning from words, metaphors, and myths. Like I just said, you cannot just use reason, rationality, not saying it doesn't have a place, of course it does, but not for creating meaning, not poetic meaning anyway. And not even any kind of meaning, because again, all the meaning that we have today owes its existence to these metaphors that have been ossified. We already said that. Any kind of abstract term you can think of goes back to some sensible object. And when you rediscover the connection from that sensible object to the words that we throw around today so kind of trivially and without thinking, it triggers that current, right? Triggers that change of consciousness, change of meaning. The same goes for words, the same goes for metaphor, and certainly the same goes for myth. Myths trigger this change of consciousness because it reawakens us to some reality that, Barfield doesn't think it's incidental. Now, again, I know it's kind of borderline mystical. I know we have a lot of people in this group that are very hardcore anti-mysticism, but I just want to say that poetry is not calculus, and you can't really, it's not, you can't write a grammar for it necessarily that will generate great poetry. And Barfield makes this point that poetry is just an expression of fundamental connections, and the aesthetic imagination that is triggered by it is basically just reigniting, reconnecting connections that have been latent in experience, in consciousness at some point in history. So let me just make this final point here with.
I just want to say one thing, folks. I'm going to invite people to comment on everything. We've covered a large ground, and would love to hear what people have said. Especially David. I know David always blows us away with all kinds of observations. So David, whatever observations you have after this, if you could spend, you can take up to 5 to 10 minutes to talk about it. And then anybody else, you can go ahead and type exclamation mark in order to comment. Go ahead, Phil.
One last point, perhaps, about the dual purpose of language. A lot of times when you hear about language and its purpose, people talk about communication. That's obvious, right? We use language to communicate, to send signals, to confer meaning. Very few times, though, you hear that language has a complete separate purpose from communication. Language has dual purpose. The second purpose is expression, not just communication. The communication part, that's the prose part, if you will. The expression part, that's the poetry. Poetry is not there to communicate necessarily some vital information. Well, although Barfield will disagree, probably say, yes, it is vital. But poetry is primarily about expression. And as trivial as it might sound, without that secondary benefit, we probably would not have the richness of language to accomplish its primary purpose, which is communication. So that's my final paste in here, and I guess we can discuss.
All right. Can you stop sharing the screen?
Yep.
Thank you. Thanks, Phil. So David S. Give me a second. Let me go ahead and unmute. David, could you, I would love to hear what you think.
Hi. Well, I'm sorry it's a little late today, and I was really enjoying listening to all the ideas that are being brought together today in this session. There weren't a lot of materials on the site information, so I didn't know which directions you're going. And I would say this idea that language is a tool, and I think it's sometimes helpful to look at language as just part of behavior. So what is it we're trying to do in behaving in the world? We're just interacting with the world for all the things we care and focus and desire, love, or are afraid of. We interact with the world in all the ways, and language has to be our tool to share with others what's going on, whether it's functional at this moment to make them, like my emotion, share my emotion and react accordingly so we cooperate tribally and behave the way we need to, or so that I can relate to them, which is a more sophisticated thing when language is not directive as much as, intersharing, a sharing thing. So I think when we look at once society is complex enough that we're not just spending all our time protecting ourselves and scavenging for, and hunting, that we start to use our minds begin to be the most important part of our lives. I mean, we start to develop, our ideation is more important than the physical doing, but then again, we are these physical beings. So when we're taken back to any historical part of language and see how much their lives entailed a certain kind of living, and we're not thinking that way, we're not using language that way anymore, it's sort of refreshing. It's like going out camping again. It's you're in the raw, you're in the nature a little closer we're so remote from nature, and language just seems to ground us. They're not thinking of the world. God's a model of something. This is the world. It's really like this is what's really happening for them. They're just telling us what's really happening. And when we say things, we're not telling you what's really happening. We're painting our impressions about what it means to us that it's happened. We are so remote from the world, that when a writer is really connecting to the world and your story is dragging you into the story, that kind of functional literature is amazing anymore, right? So I spend my time reading all this heady literature. It's about thinking about thinking. And here we are thinking about thinking about thinking. So I think language has to be able to point at itself the way we're doing, and looking at the parts of language and how they fit together. And as I said, the last time we met, right, I think all of language really functions the same as metaphor. It's just another part of its growing. It's always metaphor. It's never the thing itself, really, that I'm mentioning. I'm referring you to that thing with me, so we're together with it. But, my language isn't that thing, but it takes us to it together. And, but we're so far beyond that when we talk about language. We're examining how language is making those connections. So
Wonderful.
just watching your dazzling production. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Folks, go ahead and type by exclamation mark if you would like to make any comments or ask any questions. So responding to David, I'll make 2 points. First, when we look at these ancient civilizations, I think it is more appropriate to call them child civilizations. They're like children because they are of an earlier age. Their language and their consciousness is where our consciousness and our language came from. So this is like the Evo Devo idea. You look back. I mean, that's why we find children so delightful, because they are engaging the world for the first time and they are grappling with the fundamental way of putting together the world and acting in it, whether it is to speak the words, though they may be babbling, or take steps, though they may be stumbling. That is a very deep point. So you are seeing it's like, we are like full-grown trees with all the, lush vegetation, all kinds of things going on. When you look at an earlier time, you're looking at a sapling and then sometimes even a seed. Now, the beauty of that is that is from where everything else came. So it is seeing something in a much more simpler form. And that is what it gives us. I think that is the primary reason it gives us the poetic experience. The way in which they would have experienced it is different. It gives us poetic experience because you're seeing something far more directly than you are used to. And that produces a change of consciousness where you will say, oh, that is really interesting. That is really beautiful. David.
But isn't that partly because we've surrendered a lot of aspects in order to simplify and condense our understanding? We've given up some of the magical. We've given up things that weren't worth worrying about, and these are really there, and the kids are in contact with those. They know more than we do. They see it more directly, and we've given it, no, don't worry about that. Cars only do this and this, and trees are only for this, and they know, no, a tree is a home, a tree is they have more possibilities, and we've shed them, and their language shows us what they see.
Excellent point. I fully agree. Another way of looking at it is that we have become creatures of habit. We start using the language and the full meaning of it, which, like when a child is trying to grasp it, when you're trying to learn it for the first time, you're actually seeing the structure of it, how it functions. Then you get used to it. You have this facility at it, and you forget the entire richness, which you are actually speaking. You're speaking it, but you're not aware of the richness and beauty and the depth and the history of what you're saying. we are just looking at we are just sitting on the top of the Grand Canyon, not realizing that there is a Grand Canyon, and we're just walking around. So that is so beautiful. Thank you.
One thing, and we dismiss it as naive, and we read it once, we read Virgil, or you maybe look at certain sections a few times, but reading it over and over, you begin to see this, that it's the way of thinking is still accessible. And that using those metaphors for a while begins to open those channels for you too.
No, I mean, I agree with that. I mean, the way I say, I never think of those things as naive. Actually, I think of them always as profound, because what really matters is you engaging the world firsthand. So even when you look at a more,
But you're not the typical guy.
I know.
The typical person says, "Oh, that's that old bunk," they go,
Yeah, because they are the old bunk themselves. That's why they see only that around them. No, but what I'm saying is that you look at these earlier works of poetry or of science, right? And what I see in them is firsthand encountering the world, being alive to the world, dealing with the world. And their words are like newly minted coins. They're shiny, they are beautiful, they are handcrafted. We are the ones who have been using it for so long that all distinguishing marks have been, rubbed off, and we are just passing them along, and we are not even looking at them. We're just passing them along. So, so I have a tremendous respect for history, and because it is an original, because what really matters is the consciousness of yours seeing something new, and I deeply respect their ability of seeing something new and making it accessible to us. Thank you, David. Next up is going to be Zhang, followed by Chris. Zhang.
Yeah, this is quite fascinating, because I was just thinking today how it's so difficult to communicate with anybody about your experience, because people totally have very different experience. So it's almost impossible to communicate or share your experience. And I think, and I just talked with my son today, and he mentioned that Elon Musk was researching about the brain, and they have this monkey, actually they can move the things with their mind. So it's very interesting research. I was thinking, when we try to communicate, we basically convert our experience, then we make into language or word, then send to other person as a signal. The other person get the signal, then they have to reconvert back to the experience we experienced. The experience we experienced is totally three-dimensional with all the sensing, everything else. But when they receive the signal, it's impossible for them to convert back to what they experienced, basically. So I think the reason the art is so powerful, because they can capture a lot of things, like people share the experience somehow. So, and also the metaphor is so powerful, because I think that the metaphor usually have more sensing, just not logic, but all the the cross between different sense. That's why it's kind of like easy to connect with people. And I always wonder, people so hard to communicate. What if we just communicate through our brain? Like they said, the outer space people, they don't need to talk. You just think, then they get your brain signal, then they understand you. It will be so much easier. And my son was suggesting maybe everybody wear a helmet, then that can read your mind, then transfer to the other person's helmet, then they transfer back to their brain. So that may be much easier way to communicate. I just found today, people even have harder time to communicate, because we no longer have common experience. Everybody live their own reality, like with all this individualized news, individualized experience. So there's nothing in common. So like, for example, when I see a picture like Cinterra, like I want to visit that city. So I went there and I see it. Then the next time I see something else, I can relate to it because, oh, I've been there. So I see the picture, I can remind all the experience there. Oh, ski, you know, I have been to the mountain, I see that picture. I have all the experience, the ski, everything else, but I had never been there. I cannot recall those experiences. So I think that's why I think literature is so hard. It's get harder for people to appreciate because it needs years of training to kind of like convert experience into abstract word. Then people convert that word back to the very rich experience. You need a lot of training. That's why like cinematographer is much easier because they already make those available to you. You don't have like do this super abstraction back and forth. That's why people now even reality, you know, like they make 3D animation, now they make it super realistic. So they try to make, so it's like they no longer go through those training. They no longer need that effort. It's good and bad because you don't have more imagination because when you convert back and forth, you have to use imagination to convert that abstract boom into flash. You know, that needs training and effort, a lot of joy. But now you just see the thing as it is, then you no longer have that experience of creativity or imagination. I think that's kind of what's happening today.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Zheng. So again, I'm going to use this opportunity of connecting Zheng's point up to the meetups that we are doing. We're doing a meetup. We're going to start doing a meetup on a book called Clear and Simple as the Truth. It's the best style book that I've read. There is a sister book of that by Steven Pinker called Sense of Style, which talks about how communication works, how language works in the brain. It's the way I see it. So I'll phrase what Zheng is saying in a way in which, you know, like Pinker frames it. Our brains are these large networks. They're very large networks, and they're very deeply connected. It's a very complex network. When you're talking to another person, if I was talking to Phil, he has another completely different network, enormously dense, enormously complex, individualized in various ways. And we're talking to each other through this line, which is the line of speech, line of writing. How is it? So this is the problem. How is it that this one network can communicate, one rich network can communicate with another rich network through a line? How does that work? That is the problem. Now, the way in which this book, Clear and Simple, deals with it, it champions something called the classic style. And the classic style starts with training of describing perceptual things. So what you're doing is that you start by describing something perceptual. And the reason why this thing works is how metaphors work, because metaphors always start with perceptual things, and then they start using those perceptual things to refer to things which are more abstract, which are inferences, which are cultural context. So this classic style rests on creating this perceptual context and connecting to some equivalent perceptual context in another person's, in the listener's or reader's head. And then blending your inferences and the cultural context around that perceptual thing. So you are counting on the fact that both of you are living in the same reality, same world. And we have similar senses with which we access that. So we are counting on that in our writing or speaking. And using those, you build on that. Now, visual communication is easier because I can, for example, even while speaking, I'm using my hands. Like these are the two networks that are talking to one another. That's a much more simpler way of describing it than in words. Visual arts, use that because you can actually present a network much better as a statue, as a painting. That's why movies are popular. So, but what language can do in terms of the change of consciousness is very significant. It's very significant. So that's another question. I'll just put it as a question on the table. Given that you can do visual communication, you can draw it for people. You can act it out. What is it that language adds on the top? There is something very deep about language, because civilization really took off with when we started writing the language and use that as a foundation for human cooperation. The civilization which was possible purely without writing in oral context was with a smaller group of people. This allowed writing, so language and writing allowed us to expand that. So it's just so many great points. Next up is going to be Chris, Senzwa, and Katie. Chris, go ahead.
Hey, everybody. Yeah, it's a really interesting topic, and I guess I will be the one that's slightly neutral on this. So there's some part I like, and then there's some part I will probably just take some issue with. I do it with some trepidation because he is Barfield is sponsored by two of my favorite writers, between the Tolkien and the T. Eliot. So I'm actually arguing against my own idols. I would just say that to attribute a older form of language and metaphor with more importance, you have to, if you're going to apply that, you had to do all the way, right? So like, before our current, languages, they speak in different tongue, like during Shakespeare's time, and then they can go all the way back to the Sumerians. And before that, you have caveman language, and before that, we simply grunted, right? And made very, very simple gestures. Once you decide this thing becomes super magical and super important, right? So you have to actually distinct your point in time. So if you want to go all the way back, you really want to go all the way back when we're just grunting and making very, very simple gestures without even like any language being involved, right? Even before writing anything. So this is why I was putting the text, the way that he put it back, it really had a lot to do with, both the influence of Steiner on him, right? Which is this, he had this different thought process of evolution, not just human evolution, but overall evolution, where the normal understanding of evolution from Darwin is that we all come from very, very simple stuff and we became more complex, where Steiner and Barfield both believe that all of us came from the same archetype, except we are basically we're still very, very similar to the archetype where the other animal have devolved, right? Now, the reason I bring that up is because that's a pretty important distinction, because they postulate that one time in the very, very distant past, we have perfect language and we have perfect understanding, and we can go back to that. And that was a very, very juicy idea from Plato, right? That says like, the perfect world exists in the distant past. All we had to do is go back to it. The problem is that it sounds nice. It's just that most of the empirical evidence will go against that pretty strangely. So I think it's one thing to take value of his stress on the importance of the relationship between language and poetry, and I think this is one of the reasons writer and poets love him. And he's absolutely right, in the interrelationship. But the other one, where it comes to relate to consciousness, and especially how we go back, I would just say, hey, he stops arbitrarily, right? Where he thinks this is the perfect period, this is the good period, and this is where we should stop. But
Got it.
Based on that particular
Phil,
logic, nothing will actually ask it to stop there, right? So that's my issue with that. That's the other thing I think when Phil was talking about the difference between expression and communication is that it's very hard to make the distinction between the two logically, right? Because they're so interconnected to each other. Where if you take expression from communication or vice versa, neither thing works.
got it.
So
I'll have thank you, Chris. Really appreciate you making these observations because, we have to do all of this. There are lots of questions, and we have to approach all the questions. Phil, would you like to address any of these points?
Yeah. First of all, I just want to say from the beginning, I'm just trying to explicate what Barfield proposes. I'm not necessarily agreeing with everything he says, although I have to say I do enjoy reading about his theories. As far as this idea of going back and stopping at a arbitrary point, for philologists, they can only go back to as far as their record allows them to, right? So we can only go back so far. We have written things, right? The oral tradition. The only way it can survive is if somebody eventually writes it down. So the only record we have of language is what's been written down. Now, obviously, there were some things that have been written down that have no artistic quality to them, like tax records or whatever. So discounting that, though, right, we have very ancient examples of poetry. Now, what do we find there? The most ancient examples, right? First of all, the language itself is very interesting. What we find is words are very long in the beginning of a language, and as the language evolves, words get progressively shorter. You can see it in Greek. I studied Greek a little bit. So if you look at Homer versus Plato, Plato's words are very, in some ways, easy to read compared to Homer. Homeric language, you have these humongous words that have extra vowels and all these. If you look up in dictionary, it will say epic, as a form, because it's not used in even like 5th century. Then you go to New Testament, shorter still. The words of the vocabulary of New Testament is much easier to understand and read than than Plato, and Plato is much easier to read and understand than Homer. So what you find is contraction. Now, modern philologists will say, well, there's such a thing as roots of words, right? And it's commonly accepted practice to derive etymology by looking at roots. And Barfield says that's great, that's fine. The problem he has is if you postulate that the roots is where you start from, because again, if you look at the record, start with long and get shorter. We know this to be true even in English. If you go back to, Milton, or if you go back further to Middle English or whatever, you find that words are typically much, much longer. And then they number one, they shorten, but they also crystallize in meaning. And that's the other thing. So the meaning of words changes. It becomes much more, it comes to a point always. It starts out very wide, and then it does this. It comes to a very point. So now today, the language we use is very, very precise. We can express shades of meaning. People in Homeric times probably couldn't do it. And they probably couldn't appreciate poetry the way we can do today, because they didn't do it with their minds. They just kind of imbued it as part of the environment. But we can really zoom in and appreciate poetry in a way that they couldn't. And that's, by the way, something that I want to say, because it seems like a lot of us are saying, well, we've lost something. Yes, we have lost something. We also have gained something. What we've gained is individuation and consciousness of ourselves that people did not have back then. They had something we don't have. They had something we don't have. We have something they didn't have. We have this ability to analyze, to zoom in, and to derive poetic appreciation by engaging our intellect in a way they couldn't do. So I just want to bring that up as well, just so that we're not like just looking back and, oh, well, ages past. No. We have something definitely that we're way ahead of them. But Barfield says we can't stop there. We have to do some sort of synthesis. We need to bring our minds and our feelings into alignment with the realities. So we can appreciate it on the rational level, but we also need to appreciate it with kind of the whole being. And that's where the connections come in. So
wonderful. Thank you, Phil. I don't know Barfield as well, his work as well, so I'll just speak for myself. I think it's important to study language, history of language, as history of human beings, because those go together. That is, language is the form in which we think about what we are going to do and do it. So there's an intimate connection between human life and human language. I completely, I don't think there is a classical time, a time where there was an ideal language and then it fell off. I don't agree with that at all. Each language is designed, was actually serving that culture. And each culture had certain strong points and certain weak points. The point that Phil was making, I agree with that. Modern times, our ability of grasping the external world and being able to transform it is orders of magnitude higher than people that we're talking about. And our precision of language is what has made that possible and what is shaping that. So we have tremendous ability, a tremendous precision as compared to other people, and tremendous ability to manipulate things in the external world. And we've created this amazing world where we can be sitting together miles away. We have the leisure and we have long lives where we can actually do it. They would probably be dead by now, most of, at that time by our ages. So there is tremendous positive in the modern world. At the same time, you cannot, when you look back at an earlier time, if that time has something which is good that we have lost, we have to identify that as well. These times, the scribal times, the time, I'm taking the scribal time, around like 500 BC, somewhere between about 1500 BC to about maybe 1300, 1400, 1500, somewhere around there, that entire time period. That time period is, the hallmark of it is integrated thinking, where thoughts, emotions, and actions go together, flow together much, much better. And we see that in places like Bhagavad Gita, Tao Te Ching, or Gospel of John. And that integration is not something that most modern people have. Most modern people's lives and thoughts are far more fragmented, and they are effective at doing particular things, but they are kind of impoverished at the core of their psyche, and they're looking for something. So this point is made really beautifully by Carl Jung in Modern Man's Search for His Spirit. So it's not just that things were better at a particular point of time. They were different, and there is stuff to be learned from what we have today, and there is stuff to be learned from at different times, and we need to take in all of it. All right, next up is going to be Senzua, followed by Katie. Senzua.
Hey guys, can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. So this is my first time joining you all. Thank you for having me. I think this conversation has been very riveting. A few things that I've noticed. One, so I think kind of to your guys' point that we're talking about now, as far as language becoming more granular and more individuated, While I think that is very utilitarian and very useful as far as, creating a more kind of rich world, there is an aspect of, and I guess this is kind of what you were saying earlier, kind of an aspect of being very myopic in how we look at things, and that we almost lose the understanding of the interconnectivity between breath and wind and all these other things that we're talking about, right? So I think something that's really interesting is now that we have these faculties of language that are super granular and super myopic, if we can apply that to understanding the kind of previous context of things, how do we start having more of a richer conversation of what connective existence looks like? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that's one. Two, I think another point you guys made really interesting, Barfield made, was that language being of expression and connection or communication. And I know Chris was saying that it's hard to extricate those two things. To me, it's actually not, because it all has to do with the locus of focus of what the person is actually trying to say. So if it's expression is very internal, this is how I feel. Communication is for the other. Communication is you need to get this point what I'm saying. So I think that was pretty clear to me. And then the third point that I have, and I'm going to try to be as succinct as possible, is that so understanding what we understand about us having these complex systems and then being communicated through just a line of the words that are relatively appraised and understood based off of your own filtration system and all these other things. How do we? And one thing, let me go back up a little bit. One thing I really liked about is using that, because using the external world to understand and kind of bridge the gaps, right? So using this perceptual system that we all experience. But give me some like practical insights about how to communicate better, right? Using these perceptual understandings that we have, these commonalities, but really really understanding that we all have very complex systems and very finite filtering of other people's systems. How do we use these external perceptions? How do we use all these things that we're talking about in order to communicate cross-culturally, in order to communicate intraculturally, et cetera, et cetera? What does that look like?
All right, fantastic question. Phil, do you want to comment anything on this? If you want to comment, you can just.
I was going to throw it back to you, Shrikant. With
okay, I will do that.
Clear style.
Yes,
because I think that's more in your
Yeah, let me go ahead and take it then. Let me see here. Okay. So firstly, this is a great question. Really appreciate it. Senzwa, welcome. This is just fantastic. So first thing I would say, you made 3 points. I don't have anything to say about the second point, but the first one is very deep. That when you read, for example, I'm going to give you examples because these are the ones that we've studied in these set of meetups. Gospel of John, Tao Te Ching, and Bhagavad Gita. Each of the sentence there, anything that is presented there is so integrated, so interconnected, and so much is being done with so little. It is just mind-boggling. It is deep in what is being said, and it is incredibly beautiful, moving, inspiring at the same time. So that interconnected, how much is being brought together every time, as opposed to separating something out. So it is integrative as opposed to distinguishing. Now, on the point about what does this style look like, right? What does this communication based on perception that uses the fact that we live in the same world and have the same fundamental senses and bodies with which we interact with the world. How do we use that for communication? And that is the point of this entire book that we are in the process of going through. It's called Clear and Simple as the Truth. It not only identifies this style, separates it from other styles, historic styles, like the practical style, which is all about getting a particular thing done, or plain style, which is dealing with only everyday things, or the oratorial style where you're trying to move people to do something, or the introspective style, which is just doing a stream of consciousness about what you're feeling, or the romantic style, which holds that truth is very hard to get and only few people can get it some of the times. Classic style is what this book talks about, which is rooted in the common perception of the world and using that to ground things. I want to read out one example from Mark Twain. It's a short paragraph. This is from his life on Mississippi. When I was a boy, there was but one permanent ambition among my comrades in our village on the west bank of the Mississippi River. That was to become a steamboat man. We had transient ambitions of other sorts, but they were only transient. When a circus came and went, it left us all burning to become clowns. When first minstrel show that came to our section left us feeling all suffering to try that kind of life. Now and then we had a hope that if we lived and were good, God would permit us to be pirates. These ambitions faded out, each in its turn, but the ambition to be a steamboat man always remained. So you can see here, he's talking about a time more than 100 years ago. He's talking about a place which I've never seen. But the way in which he's describing that, circus coming through, a minstrel show coming through, steamboats coming through, I can connect it up with new things that I see. So perceptually, what it feels like to encounter new things. He's basing that to saying that in some things you get excited about it, and then the excitement dies down. That is now connecting to many such things. Now, I don't feel that way about the circus. I don't feel that way about the minstrel show. But there are things I feel that way about. So I connect those feelings with that. And then he talks about things that remain, that keep coming, no matter how long ago it was, it remains with you. And it is something that is really going to shape your thoughts and shape your actions. You're actually going to become a steamboat man because you saw it. Now, in this very simple description of this life and experience of him and his comrades, he is describing something really deep about human experience itself. That there are things which are transient and there are things which will change your life. And he does that so simply that you did not even realize that that was what was going on. That is the style. Now, the beauty of this book is that it shows you how to do this. It has a series of exercises. He says, this is something has already been worked out in 17th century France and has been practiced by many, many, many people. A lot of the science writing of people like Newton on optics, or Faraday in his experiments, or Lavoisier on his elements is like this. They will start describing something very perceptual and then give you the inference, give you the deeper insights. Same thing with Mark Twain, same thing with Jefferson in his Declaration of Independence, or some review of the rights of a British America, in Virginia, his Virginia document. All of them are like that. They start with concretes and they will take you to the highest levels possible. And they do it with such power, clarity, and simplicity. And this book actually takes you through a series of exercises. And we are in the process of practicing it. So we're going to start that in October, mid-October. Thank you very much. Great points. Next up is going to be Katie.
I'm responding to Jane's comments a while back about we all have such different experiences. And I think that's what still relates to metaphors, because I think you can kind of analogize to things that you've experienced. So maybe like you didn't say lose your dad in high school. It's like, I remember someone in this group said his dad died in high school. And it's like, well, he probably felt left out. Have you ever felt left out? It's like, sure, everybody, it's like, not getting invited to a party and then feeling like everybody else is going to that party and you're not invited to that party. So I think it's just applying those correct or like, decent enough metaphors or analogies. And then when you sometimes that happens to me too, where I remember I made a mistake. I remember I had my dogs with me and I was looking all around for dogs and there were no dogs. And my dog almost knocked over a little girl. And I was like, oh my gosh, I had no frame of reference for that. But then I have to analogize. Have other people ever done something where they had no frame of reference from it? It's like, yeah, that happens to them. So for me, that's what I'm always constantly using analogies or it's not perfect. And I kind of use emotional reasoning on it to kind of close the gap on experiences. But I like to kind of think of metaphors as ways for just as long as you use the, pretty decently good at metaphors to help with understanding other people.
No, absolutely great. Fantastic point, Katie. I mean, that's what, that's what metaphors do, because they're indispensable to communication. Because you have to see, when you're trying to connect one network to another, right? You're trying to connect your context to another context. You're trying to establish common knowledge, right? Metaphors has always two parts. One is metaphor, the thing that you're familiar with, pointing to things that you're not familiar with. When you use metaphors, you are actually selecting something which is far more easily accessible to anybody than the thing that you're talking about. And you're using that. Many times you can use multiple metaphors. So you can use multiple things that people are familiar with in order to point to things. And then always, all communication is two ways. So you watch what they are saying, and then you provide what is missing. So that process, and I don't think that you can do that as well without metaphors. And if you can do it, if you think you're doing it without metaphors, understand that language is full of metaphors. So you're doing it in hidden metaphors in your literal language. So thank you, Katie. Let's see. All right, Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, I also wanted to comment on that, what Katie said. So obviously, we're complex, right? So we have individual experiences that are our own and unique. And that's what makes us human, right? We're not all identical. However, Barfield makes this distinction about what he calls incidental metaphors. And those incidental metaphors are probably unique to whoever is designing them or devising them or expressing them. So they're not going to carry over. They're still interesting. They're still, again, great writers will use these incidental metaphors to describe things. But there's a difference. He makes this distinction between that, which has just some aesthetic value and maybe some communication value even, but definitely expressive value. And he makes a difference between that and the fundamental metaphors that carry across all of humanity. And we know this to be true because everyone reads and loves the Iliad. Everybody. I mean, I don't care who you are, what culture you're from, whether you're Chinese or Greek or German or Russian or whatever. you have this world literature that gets translated into every language. Why does it get translated? Because people sense there's something that is not incidental, but is in fact fundamental to the human experience, just like Shakespeare, right? Shakespeare is translated into every language. Why is that? Because he recants these stories that express the most fundamental human urges, conditions, etc. Right? But in addition to that, he also has a wonderful language to describe all of that. So that's the, I just want to point that out, that in fact, there are incidental metaphors and fundamental, or what he calls true metaphors. And the true metaphors, of course, are verbalized in myth as a story. So a metaphor obviously is like a short expression, but a myth is essentially like an expansion of that into a whole story, which again can be summarized maybe in back to an expression, and then that back into a word. And here's an example, beautiful examples. We have these words that actually go back to gods, that go back to stories. Think of a word, panic. That goes back to Pan, the god that induced panic, and you have all these stories that have to do with disorder and so forth. What about fury, right? Same thing. Fortune, fortuna. I mean, it's just, and you can iris, right? I mean, there's just so many, all these words, they're ossified. We don't even think about them. We throw them around, oh, did you get your iris checked or whatever? But as soon as I point out that connection, there's this living history that comes back. And I don't know that it necessarily has a lot of communication value, but it definitely has a ton of expression value. And that's where I would say, I think Senswa was asking about how do we make communication better. Well, I would say, poetry is not about effective communication. I wouldn't say that. I would say it's more about effective expression, poetic expression. Right? It's about aesthetics. So if you're in a fire, don't use poetry. Don't use Homer to communicate with the firefighters. You have better, more effective way of communicating with them. But if you're living, then use Homer and use because that brings fullness to your human experience. So that's my comment.
Thank you. I mean, I kind of see them as together, because it's like it's like
well, they're two sides of the same coin, because again, if we go back to the origin of meaning, you could not derive meaning without these expressive words, right? Expressive connections. Once they're made, we forget about them and we just use the words themselves because the meaning is already embedded. But initially, I think it was Chris who brought up this idea of primitive languages, and even today we have tribal tribes, and they communicate orally. Think of Eskimos. They have all these words for snow, but they might not have complicated abstract terms. Well, what they'll do is they'll use the snow to communicate with you about something abstract. So they'll use the sensible things they can, because it's a tautology, right? They can't define what they're talking about, but they'll just describe it in terms of the things that are there. And that is so beautiful, because we've forgotten how to do that. Like David was saying, we are removed from nature. And whenever somebody actually uses nature to reconnect our abstract terminology and concepts back to the sensible things, that actually creates some current, some change of consciousness, and a pleasant aesthetic experience that he thinks goes back to the fact that those things are somehow fundamentally connected. That's a controversial point. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. I mean, I see them as being connected at the hip. So for example, when you point out like fury and fortune, I notice that in my mind, you're actually communicating something, because what it does is that it actually produces some new connections in my mind. So the expression which sits on the top of the communication, that expression, what shall I say? Like some of the most powerful prose carries with it that expression. In some things you don't need to, like what this book calls the practical style. You're not focused on the expressions, but in course of living, the conceptual meaning and the emotional concomitant of it, and the action that is going to result from it kind of flow together. So in that sense, I think they're together. And every time I look back at this verse, I like the word that you use for, ossified. I'll put it a little bit more extremely. Words are living, but most people use only corpses, in the sense that they're kind of carrying some of the forms of it, but they're not as living as they could be. They serve the function, but they don't do as much that can be done. All right, folks, I'm going to give priority to people who have not spoken before, and then we will do the second round. So it's going to be Joe followed by Judy. Joe.
Yeah, I think actually you've covered my question since I've been, since you've been talking. Actually, the Eskimo example was a perfect example. I was just going to ask a quick question about what makes a language more precise, and what there's variability in the precision of language and in different parts of the world. But the Eskimo example that actually Phil just provided kind of gave me a insight into that. The idea you have so many forms of ice, it's the environment itself, and then how that language evolves from that is focuses on precision. But I don't know if you have any additional comments on that.
Phil, would you like to talk?
Yeah. Again, if we look at history, how these things sort of evolved, and we do have some examples in Greek language, all over the place. Initially, they were all sensible things, sensible meaning physical things, and then they grew into abstract concepts much later. So everything starts out with the physical referent, right? Bark, in Greek is hule. And then from that, we have all kinds of words that describe matter. And, there's just a lot of stuff from there, from bark, right? Matter goes back to mother. Now, what happens is, initially, those terms covered a lot of territory, like pneuma covered spirit, wind, breath, etc. As language evolves, these terms and the meanings start to split up. And you have more specialized words come into the language to describe the split up meaning. So there's this, constantly there's this more specialization takes place in an older language. In younger languages, you just don't have the terms. And so everything is kind of this big whole that is all connected. And eventually it's all connected to physical things, because that's what we start out with. That's how children also start out with the general concept. Barfield makes a point about saying to a child, everybody is a papa. he calls any man a papa because that's all he knows. But then he realizes that papa is a more special term for the special person. So that's papa, but that's a person right out there. But initially, it's all papa, right? Whoever he sees. And so some of these things, like from child psychology and child development, they give us hints into how languages start out very, very broad in meaning, and then they tend to specialize, especially language like English that suffuses terminology from all kinds of other languages, and then you have extremely precise, crystal clear, shades of gray type of words, that is great. Again, which heightens our mental appreciation. Poetry becomes more mental, less perceptive and sensual, I guess, more very intellectual, and but we always like to go back to Homer, because that gives us back the sensual experience of reading about gods, doing things in the seas and the heavens, and everything is full of divine sort of intervention and all that kind of stuff.
Excellent point, Phil. I completely agree. It's just that languages, you can look at it purely numerically. Forget about poetry for a moment. Just language, precision of language. You can look at the simple way of looking at it. It's just the number of words that you have, because the words are added because they serve a function to make further distinction. So the number of words in English now is much, 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 much larger than what was there in the older Greek, or even French. Some time ago. So
quick example in English, a word from King James Bible, conversation. conversation meant what we have right now, plus it just meant life. Our conversation is in heaven. In other words, our habitat, where we converse. So conversing is not just talking, but it's living. Now, the meaning has split. We don't use conversation for that. We use conversation for a verbal dialogue. So a crystallized meaning, right? We use something else for determining where you habituate, right? Habitat or.
Oh, I really like that. For 52 living ideas, conversation is life is
Yes.
Good motto. Excellent. Next up is going to be Judy, David, and Chris. Judy.
Yes, I'm fascinated by all this, and I wanted to add something to the words, metaphors, and myths continuation. And I wanted to add the word or the concept of mysticism to myths and metaphysics and magic and all these. Santa Teresa de Avila, for example, comes to my mind. So many mystical writers have used metaphors in sacred writings. And it's just like part of the progression that words take to get there, to the mystical, to the magic, to the metaphysics. Is there something to that? I mean, can you add that concept to words, metaphors, and myths?
Phil, would you like to
Yeah,
comment?
I would say yes, absolutely. Because when you think about it, what is alchemy? What is Gnosticism? It's about restoring lost connections, right? Or positing connections that are not obvious, right? Transmuting some base metal into gold. But really what you're trying to do is some internal transformation, right? The physical is just a symbol of some internal transformation. In Gnosticism, you have all of these ideas about the soul being, you have to reascend through all these different planets and get back to the origin somehow. And so, yeah, I would say totally, all of these things, they're not necessarily literally true, but they symbolize a yearning for some sort of unity. Mm-hmm. And that's what these metaphors and the words they point us to. There's some unity in meaning that is often lost because the words have split up, like we just talked about. So we want to gather the split up meaning back together and see what's happening with that. And poetry helps us do that because it connects the split up meaning through these links, the metaphorical links, right? Mm-hmm. He is a ship. I don't know, like I can't think of it right now, but there's so many metaphors that, they connect those split up meanings. And if they're fundamental or true metaphors, like Barfield says, then they're universal and they carry over for everybody can sense that this is something that's true.
Thank you. Next up is going to be David. David, go ahead.
Right. Just wanted to throw in 2 additional observations. One is you're talking about the fragmentation of large words into smaller, more pinpointed concepts as the language diversifies in its dividing to make finer and finer grains of description. There's an analogy with the way alphabets and written language has worked, that it went from pictograms to phonetic representations to abstract fractured elements of a phoneme, letters that, so when you write a word down, it no longer has zero connection as it appears to the meaning. But, we've made it the most efficient, minimal representative way of expressing ourselves because we need to make so many combinations and we don't want every word to be 26 letters, so like it's sort of funny to tell
zeros and ones.
yeah. We use the same word, wind and wind, and but we know how to say it if we learn the language. So that's one thing. It reminded me of the telephone systems. Did you know that to dial like in Sydney, Australia, the Sydney area code is 01, and then you dial like an 8-digit phone number. But if you want to dial Brunebeck, one of these tiny little towns in the Back Bay, it's like an 8-number code to get to the city, and there's phone number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. So as you get to a finer level of detail, you have to decide how you're going to represent it the most efficiently. That's just a side. So the other thing was about the thesis here. It's about the mechanism we're talking about. How can we possibly allow ourselves to transmit a meaning on this simple linguistic channel that is so reduced? How can we have meaning in our words and get this deep meaning? How can we press out of ourselves and over to the other person an entire symbolic image or story? And I think there's a sort of dialectical aspect to this thesis. We're saying that we're expressing the shared outer thing, but I'm saying there's something actually inner that comes before that, that's more primordial. So in a sense, the outer rests on the foundation of this inner. So the claimed external system to which we point, like up or down, which we use to communicate as something we saw in the world, those, when we look at it, there's another layer of analysis, I think, to see that those come from your inner actual relationship to your physical being, which you are making sense of. So up and down only begin to make sense as you re-examine your own experience, and that's what we're communicating from anyway. So the fact that up means this now, or if I use it in a contrary way, as long as it comes out of that inner sense, it's going to be able to communicate. So metaphors can not only be invented, but they can also reverse the meanings of words and senses of things, right? Because what we're communicating comes from our internal system. We have this common biological, mental, human shared way of confronting all of our mental experience. And it's internally that we form these structures that we're going to use for understanding and conceptualizing the world. Other people are doing that same work, and we're going to share something in there by making the same context in me be recognized. And now the language means something in that part of the context. So but before we even begin to act, and let alone use language in the external world, it has to come from the internal conceptualizing. You can't even make an utterance that is part of a language before you've conceptualized there's another mind that I'm getting out to. So yeah, you've got your mind, but until there's another mind, your utterances, which may be an expression of your energy, physical passion and doing, are not a language. Not until you conceptualize, oh, there's the other mind too. So it has to come from within you that you're making that outer world something. And because we all have this, this common structure of building in our minds, at least philosophically, theoretically, that's why we can channel on these little thin channels, because we really have the same way of framing things inside, right?
Thank you, David. I know Phil needs to leave pretty soon. Phil, would you like to, but I would like to continue the discussion. But Phil, do you want to make any comments, any kind of closing thoughts before you have to leave?
Yeah, just maybe just as a summary, it seems like this idea of metaphors and fundamental or true metaphors versus incidental is, has emerged in the conversation as an important topic. So I just want to leave it out there. And also something that we started with in terms of imagination and its role, both for perception, creation, construction of the world, and its secondary role as a poetic device. Something that I think probably has a lot of connections to some of the other meetups you guys have done with this idea. Poesis in Greek means create, and imagination is right there. It's a creative function without which we probably wouldn't be able to exist. But unfortunately, we've become so pragmatic that we think imagination is just something for poets, but actually we do it every day. We make the connections, we make sense of the world through our imagination. And great poets use the same faculty to recreate links that have been lost. So that, I guess, that those are probably like 2 points that I want to leave with everybody just on the metaphors and imagination.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Phil. Folks, especially people who have not said anything yet, I would love to hear from each of you what you think of this topic, because this is a topic of, of language is of tremendous interest to me, and I'm looking to do more things on it. So if you have not spoken before, please go ahead and type exclamation mark and talk about what was your general impression of this meetup? What did you learn? Did you find it interesting? At that level, like some feedback. Okay, thank you, Senja.
Hey, Shrikant, is it possible I could just make a point, because I got to run like soon also. So I think you skipped me a couple times.
Quick point. Yes, go ahead.
No, I just think well, I think one thing that hasn't been addressed, right? Like, just golf. I don't know if Phil is still here. I think imagination can be taken many different ways, right? So when you create the internet, right? Or
sorry, you create what?
When you create the internet, or when you go into space, it takes the same amount of imagination when Picasso draws his paintings, or when like T.S. Eliot writes his poetry. So imagination comes in all forms, right? To say that we are non-imaginative or less imaginative than the past, it's a conjecture. I just don't know if he can actually have any, real evidence to prove that. That could be opinion, for sure, right? I just don't actually know that's actually true. I think the difference is that we are just so much more specialized. So the one thing I don't want to leave the people with is that, when Homer, wrote his masterpiece, on Earth, we estimate have 50 million people at that time, right? Now we have 8 billion people. So just give you a sense of scale. If at Homer's time they had 8 billion people, that means there will be 160, Homers writing this work, and would his work still have the same impact on our, overall literature and culture as it has if it's increased that, by 160 times? The reason that we value these works so much, not because they're not good works, but because when there were so few people, if you think the human history as a human project,
got it. Yep.
well, when we only have like 5 or 6 people, that person had to do everything. When you have 8 billion people, we have been specialized to do very particular things. You can be very imaginative, right, in those very particular things, but can you be as integrated as back when you were 5 or 6 people, when you have to do everything? I think it comes down to a management of your personal resources in both time and energy, right? So I think it's not really addressed, because I think it just gets swept up under the rug to say, oh, this is possible. I just think that we have to also think about, like the limitation that we have, right?
Thank you, Chris. So let's look at this. Imagination over time. I mean, one of the things about Homer, I think the point about the number of people is very well taken. I would love to see it multiplied, and I think we would have, how many Homers now? Should be
160.
100, only 160? No. What was
I'm trying to think. My math could be wrong, right? So it's 8.
No, your math is wrong. How many people were there at that time?
50 million.
50
Is
million.
it 1,000 in a billion, right?
50,000. Yeah, 50,000. Okay, 50,000. 50 million, right? So 50 million. So that's 500 million. This one. Okay, so I would love it if there were 160 Homers. Okay, so the point is this. There are many things going on here at the same time, and you have to distinguish all of them. Homer inspired a generation. It inspired people, a people, the ancient Greeks, who then created this entire thing. So when you look at the influence of a particular work, you have to trace the impact it has had across time to the present day. So the reason Homer is as powerful is, I mean, one of the evidence of that is the impact it has had. Same thing with Tao Te Ching, Bhagavad Gita, Gospel of John. You have to look at the impact it has had. The other thing is that these works dealt with the nature of human being itself, and that is something that all of us have to contend with. So these are deep philosophical works. So they can be art, they can be religion, but fundamentally they are showing you a way of approaching reality, and they're showing you something fundamental, and that is why they have the kind of power that they do. Now, what about modern times? I mean, in some ways, we are specialized and we have to focus on some things to get things done. But our abilities of putting things together today, abilities of learning today, is so much more than in Homer's time. Our knowledge is so vast. We are standing on all these shoulders. So what imagination should be possible today should be much, much higher than imagination at that time, because knowledge is so much more. More than that, we can interact with one another. How many people could Homer talk to? And how many people can you talk to, interact with, learn from? I mean, so what should be possible now in terms of knowledge and imagination, if you choose to do it, should be higher. That's how I think about it. Would love to hear, folks, what you thought of this meetup. But first, Mike, go ahead.
Okay. A couple things really struck me about this. And first of all, it reminded me of Brian McVeigh's stuff and how he operated. And what drove me into that direction is DLJ mentioned the term entropy. Now, entropy in physics is a measure of disorder, but it's also in Shannon, it's a measure of information content. And when you have the verbal language, you have information content in terms of added in terms of body language, among other things. But when you have written language, you have an additional information content. Now, it should be noted that up until relatively recently, written language was not just read quietly, it was chanted. It was read out loud. And there's additional information in Homer, in the Odyssey, in Plato, in the Bible, in terms of little flourishes in the calligraphy type letters that told where each of those things had meaning in terms of the music as to how it could be how it should be chanted. Now, Brian McVeigh spent a lot of time in Japan, and he presented a statement that Oriental culture, which went from up to down or down to up, depending on which region you were in and which version of the language, gave and pictographs rather than a phonetic language carried a different kind of information. And he presented that was the reason why the inscrutable Japanese Oriental mind worked a little bit differently than the than the Western mind, and both to their advantage and to their disadvantage. Now, he also came up with a statement, there's information in some languages go from left to right, and some languages go from right to left. And that's another bit of information. Kerry, I don't remember all of the reasons that he had, but that kind of made a statement as to the differences in the different cultures, in particular, whether they use vowels or only consonants in the language. And some of the Middle Eastern language, Aramaic and Hebrew, don't have vowels. So there's a lot of information in how the thing is structured. There's another concept called acrostic. There's E.E. Cummings had a concept where he didn't use any punctuation, but he judiciously used spacing.
Thank you. Thank you,
yeah.
Mike. Great observation. I want to comment a couple of things, and then folks would love to hear, if you have not spoken before, just would love to hear what you got from this meetup, or any comment on anything that was said. So this point about differences in language, especially between, for example, the three large cultures, the West, the Chinese and Indian cultures, is very striking. The Chinese script, and especially the Japanese script, is very visual, and how it operates, I think, it's very, very different. The amount of emphasis placed on the sound itself in the Indian context is very different. It has been an oral culture for a long period of time. So there's all kinds of things of language on the top of these. But love to hear what you guys have to say. Next up is going to be Brian, followed by Evanique. Brian, what did you think?
I really appreciated this meetup. It's Penny, I think also she's here with me. I'll let her talk. But I also appreciate, she also, I'm sure, appreciated, because we spent this afternoon listening to the last one that we had missed. And we were prompted to do that from prior discussions you had had on the topic of language. And now I think we understand much better what you're saying. And I think it is a very, first of all, I guess that I am struck. I really agree and endorse what has been said. It just all makes so much sense. And it's something I wasn't really in touch with. The to me, the topic of discussion tonight was primarily the metaphor and myth. And of those two, the metaphor. And yes, I really appreciate having fleshed that out. And I don't know where you can go with it, but I'm interested in seeing what's possible. I'm a bit adrift at the moment. See what Penny, if Penny has anything.
Penny.
Oh, no, I think it's a fascinating discussion. I mean, language is so central for humans, and to start kind of thinking about what was the origin of it, where did it come from, how do we communicate with each other, is really, really very interesting. And, different languages depict different worldviews. One thing, I just had to throw this out, because when we were discussing, I thought of this, because I speak Spanish too. And one of the phrases in Spanish that just amazed me when I first learned that was like, if you drop something, you say, se me cayó. It fell, basically. It fell to me. I didn't drop it, it fell.
Well, it's one of the most passive things that's active all around you, right?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Penny. I think, there's just so much here. I can I grew up speaking Marathi. So one of the things I do now is that whenever I'm thinking about something really complex, I try to express it in Marathi, not translate. Translate is different. You're saying, okay, how would I express it in Marathi? And it's actually very fascinating to see the structure. It's actually a different structure. How you approach the topic, what is the concepts used. And because I have not been speaking Marathi much, and I know Marathi very well as a kid, it's a really interesting experience, because when I see something, it strikes, because of its novelty, relative novelty to me right now, I notice it. And because of my deep familiarity with it in the past, I understand what it is. So it's like seeing the history come alive as I'm formulating it in that. So as you were saying, language, we speak in language and we take it for granted, right? But just a little bit of consciousness being added to a particular word, particular phrase, whether it is in the terms of roots or where it came from, what is the metaphor that is embedded in it, it adds so much richness to what we are doing today, day-to-day speaking and day-to-day communication. So thank you. Penny, did you have anything more? Okay. Next up is going to be Evanik. Evanik, how is it?
I thought this was a very interesting meetup. I think I'm still trying to wrap my head around what was said tonight. Like you said, the material is very deep, and especially around the concept of metaphor and how it's used to explain something, like you're using something that you know well to express something that you don't know well. And I guess I'm just going to have to really observe and see, because I never thought of language as we talked about it tonight.
Can I say something? I can give you an example, which will make this very clear. We've been studying, Bhagavad Gita and Gospel of John and Tao Te Ching. The center periphery, right? Center periphery idea that we have been using, just that diagram. That is a metaphor. Like, center is the core of your being and periphery is what is out there. And that actually simplifies things so well. And it allows you to connect all the other ideas within Gita, between Gita and this. And so look at how simple it is. It's just the core of you and away from you. That's a great example of what a metaphor can do at its best. This is what Barfield would call a true metaphor, in the sense that something that allows you to structure and look at a fundamental pattern, because language and concepts are all about identifying patterns that we see in nature. So it is, this center periphery captures a very deep pattern. And that's why when you start using it, you say, oh, I understand what is being said, because that metaphor, you can hang everything on that metaphor. So that's, sorry to interrupt, go ahead.
No, that did help a lot. Understand the concept. And I think with myth or mysticism, that's something that's very deep that I have to explore more. But I think I came away with a lot more things to think about, rather than, I don't know, I just came, I guess to sum it up, it was a great meetup, and I came away with a lot to think about and a lot to ponder on.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Evanik. Next up is going to be Ron, followed by Brian. Ron. Ron, you need to unmute. Okay. Next up is going to be Brian. Brian, go ahead.
Well, as I said, I did feel I really appreciate and I think I understand, but it feels kind of like with Evan feel a little adrift. But after saying that, I did see a possible connection between what you're doing here with metaphors and what we'll be doing with clear and brief as truth. So that's something that I'll be interested in watching. I guess the possibility I see is that brief and clear metaphors as truth is what strikes me. I don't know.
Yeah, no, it is very much, I think the reason that clear and simple as truth works is because of this, the fact of metaphors. So thank you. Next up is Ron. Ron, go ahead.
Shrikant, you can hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, so just two thoughts that came up. Fascinating conversation, way more than I could, it's just so much. But that words and language are different than the initial experience. The initial experience of anything happens in the present. When you use language, you redo it, you represent. Words represent. They're not the actual experience. They're a represent, trying to get back to the present. So then they're sort of secondary. Okay. Now, the other point I was wondering about is that the spiritual teacher that I've been reading the last few years, Nisargadatta, he only spoke Marathi, which is the language you mentioned that you speak.
Yes.
And when his book, I Am That, was translated, it was translated by Maurice Friedman, who was a Polish Jew who spoke about 20 different languages. Now, what I would be fascinated, because, and I understand that Marathi is a very sort of basic, straightforward language, very clear cut, supposedly. So I would be interested if when you look at, say, a paragraph of Nisargadatta in Marathi, and then you try to translate it for us into English, and now you're going to a representation of a representation. It's interesting that how much is lost in the representations, how much is lost in language. That's why all the mystics always say, words stop short. We can't all we can do is point to or give metaphors in the sense of it's sort of like, but it's not. So, but on the other hand, we need language for practical phenomenal existence. We have to function, but I think it's important to understand the limitations, and I understand that how poets try to overcome these limitations. Anyway, those are just some of my thoughts.
Thank you, Ron. So I'll say a couple of things. So firstly, reality is primary. So I like the metaphor of map and territory. So there is territory, and what you're doing is you're mapping it with language. And you'd always remember that map is not the territory. That's what the Tao says. Tao is Tao. You can name it, but the name is not the Tao. And that's profoundly true. So you have to always regard, keep that in mind. Second point on translation is very interesting because I'm very, very familiar with this issue because I ended up reading Jnaneshwari, which is 13th century Marathi, during, in order to prepare for our Gita meetups. And I did translate some of Jnaneshwar for our group. I translated some poems. I translated. What I found was that my first experience of trying this out was when I was reading Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. So there are a couple of points where there is translation itself from one language to another, which is a hard thing because each language has its own history of words, own way in which that language has built up the metaphors. Like Penny was saying about, Spanish, it fell. Another dramatic example of that, using front and back. Like in the Western civilization, we consider future in the front. You face the future and the past is at your back. Because we are an active civilization. We think that we hold that we can do things. And what has happened is already at the back. I'm focused on what I'm going to do. There are cultures for whom the past is in the front and future is at the back. Why? Because they're largely a passive culture. It's just like it fell. It's a passive culture because they're saying, obviously, past is something that what happens. It's right there in front of you. Future, who knows what's going to happen in the future? It's behind me. I can't see it. It's going to just come and grab me. It is going to do what it will. And I can't see it. That's very different way of thinking. So these metaphors and the system of metaphors that you use has profound impact on how you think. For example, this book, George Lakoff's book, which I recommend, talks about the various metaphors that are used to describe love. Love, most of thoughts that we have about love are different kinds of metaphors. Love as a partnership, love as a refuge, love as war, love as a journey. And each of these are different. And depending on which ones you use as the primary way of thinking about love, there is going to be difference in that. So metaphors, the way you are using them or way a culture uses them has profound significances. Now, having said that, different cultures have focused on different things. So for example, the Indian culture has focused on the consciousness a lot. So the concepts of consciousness that Sanskrit has or Marathi has, Marathi is a language which is derived from Sanskrit. It's far more richer. So when I was studying Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, I couldn't stand the English translations because I know enough of Sanskrit. I can read about 85%. I knew that it was really, the concepts were not matching up at all. And I had to find a Marathi translation of it. So it is because Sanskrit, the Indian culture has been focused on consciousness. The vocabulary to deal with consciousness is far richer than the West. So translating that is very, very hard. It can be done, but you really need to know the material also. And and the kind of translation, we experienced that with Dao De Jing. We had so many people read so many different translations of it. And there are different ways of doing it, literal. I've mostly looked for translations which capture the spirit of it, even though it is not literally the same, because literal means that you are trying to use the same metaphor, and the same metaphor may not work exactly like that in a different language. What you really want to do is to get the spirit of things right. And if you actually understand the text, you can do that, but you have to have the courage to express things differently. It's like, to give a dramatic example of somebody making a movie out of a book. Most people fail because they don't do it right. Only if you can grasp the heart of the book and then have the mastery of the movie medium, you can actually produce something like Lord of the Ring, which actually does a very good job of showing something which is vision analogous to the original. So thank you, Ron. Next up is going, Ron, you had some follow-up?
Yes, I just wanted to add one more idea to make it even a little bit more complex. I'm fascinated by an author. I don't know if you're familiar with him, Ian McGilchrist.
I'm very familiar.
Okay, so he spent a lifetime looking at right-left hemisphere and how the brain processes data very differently, zoom out, zoom in, etc. So here's another layer of complexity in our communication. An event happens and you and I experience it, but you may be a right hemisphere person and I may be a left hemisphere. And so first of all, the same event is experienced by us differently, number one. And then we try to share our experience of it using the language, which again is a representation of our experience. So it shows how difficult it is to actually to have a genuine dialogue where you're actually you're actually getting into the other person's experience and vice versa. It takes a tremendous amount, and I think this, when there's 10 people and everything's going back and forth, it's like to me, I can't. Everything is way too on the surface for me personally as an experience.
Thank you, Ron. The great works somehow manage to speak to a whole bunch of people. Like people, we've seen Tao Te Ching, Bhagavad Gita, we've seen Gospel of John, we are reading Goethe, Homer, and that's the level at which you have to be able to produce speech and writing. If you want to be able to speak, you have to understand the different ways in which people access things, and you have to be able to speak to all of them in their own way. It's a very difficult dance. But I think the fundamental solution I have is that of conversation, that you actually converse with people, go back and forth, in order to do that. So conversation is the model of communication, which is far more stabler than one-way communication. So I always think in terms of that. Next up is going to be Joe. Joe, go ahead.
I appreciated this session. We've gone over in the past the power of words and how words can transform our consciousness by themselves, and how they can be applied to multiple things to expand our understanding of the world. And I think that metaphors actually brings us, the way we're discussing them here, brings them to another level as well. The one last thing I would say is that the one thing that I've gotten out of the Tao Te Ching and as well as Confucius is the translation aspect of it, walking through that translation and actually looking for the words that actually work from the concepts of previous times, understanding the historical context, and then understanding our context has been extremely, it's a very hard task that Jason's taking on, and he's always soliciting feedback. That is extremely powerful, and understanding metaphors actually helps us with that process. So I mean, I think that this is a very good framework for us to keep building on. I find it interesting what Owen Barfield his theory on it and need to read a little bit more. But this was a very good meetup overall. I mean, it was very well done, and gives me more to think about, which is about all you can ask of for a meetup.
Yes. Thank you, Joe. Really appreciate that. Does anybody else have anything? You're welcome to. David, would you like to say anything else?
I guess on the side, we've been having a little chat about how much reality can be summoned by an author and by words, and how much you can experience something new. And you can't, one point of view is you can't replace real experience with the letter on the page. On the other hand, I'm not so sure. You get new experiences when you experience a novel, a book, a sacred work. And when you read it again, you don't read it the same way. So I'm not sure, even in this discussion in the chat, that we're actually saying the same things to each other. It's so subtle. It's very hard to translate what's being said into what the person meant. So it's challenging, even in the same language, to say certain things, and just appreciate that in this experience.
Absolutely. Thank you. I mean, it's really, that's a great point. I think Zheng had something to add. Zheng, go ahead.
Yeah, Zheng.
Yeah, so I think language is a tool for human expression or communication. And what we try to communicate is our experience, or either physical experience or mental experience. So I think sometimes I found people easily replace the media we use, replace the real thing a lot of times. Like, for example, like we have a telephone. When the telephone first come to life, like it become a status symbol, like big cell phone. Like Chinese people, they like carry this big cell phone to show their status. They forgot the purpose of phone is communicate instead of. And there's a movie about they used to write the lantern when they have several wives. They go to which courtyard, and there's a movie. I don't know if people watch it. Then the person is so obsessed with the lantern, so it's like they end up lit all the lanterns. But just it's an interesting story about how people so easily obsessed with the media instead of what that media's purpose, like language. The language is for us to convey our experience. The experience is way more important than the media itself. Now we may not use language. I actually think the reason we use language because of printing, publishing. Now, why the modern people, the younger people no longer into literature, because they have a new communication form, which is YouTube. So they no longer have the patience to read through all the literature book, but they communicate the meaning already, use a different format, which have the sound, have the thing, every single thing together, instead of like we have to rely on print before, because that's the only way of communication at that point. Just like architecture, we used to use blueprint because that's the way we communicate 3D buildings, and we make it into 2D abstract. Reading only professional can understand. Then we use that to create a 3D building. We no longer need that anymore. We can have 3D model, then build 3D building. Why we still now have 2D print? Because that's the old way of thinking. So we convey the 3D model into 2D print. Then they make this 2D print into 3D building. Like we still live in old media, even though we no longer need that. You understand? So I think people still live in the traditional way of communication, even though we no longer need that anymore. But because of our get used to it or traditional way of thinking, that's why I think younger people, they may not think the same way as how we rely on the way of communication. I just want to throw that out.
Thank you, Zheng. So I'll say a couple of things. What happens is that each of the media has its own positives and the negatives. So consider YouTube. YouTube is just a version of TV. So consider television versus written work. Now the television is far more powerful because it actually brings back the oral communication. But it brings back the oral communication without the entire envelope oral communication. That means oral communication used to happen within families, within people that you knew, people whose character you knew. It was happening within a context of your life where the people who were talking to you had some kind of a positive regard for you. They had skin in the game, in the sense that they were in a relationship with you of some kind, and that is the context in which the oral communication was taking place. Now, when you move to a media like television or movies, yes, it brings back the thing that was lost of the multimedia level, and it is integrated, it is fully there. What is it that it loses? It's also, Marshall McLuhan has this way of analyzing media. It's called the tetrad. So whenever you see if it enhances something, you can say, what is it that it cuts out? The beauty of the written page is that you can think about what is said. It is very hard to do that when you're passively taking in a lot of media directly. You tend to, they appeal to your emotions in a certain way, and you get carried away with it. Written media, especially when you're producing it, like when you are writing, for example, you can think about what you're thinking. You can say, did I get it right? Was it precise enough? Am I missing something? How does it connect with other things? You can't be doing that while you're watching television. So there are positives and negatives of everything. Now, the great thing about digital media, it is more of everything. It is, if you want more of writing, you can have more of writing. If you want more of oral communication, where you're just chatting with your friends, doing Zoom with your friends, you can do that. If you want to be watching TV, you can go on YouTube, and you can use combinations of any of these things. So you are able to build your media, the combination of media which you think is right for you. And of course, it's going to have consequences. And the consequences are going to be different for different person, as opposed to everybody watching TV, what happens to them, or everybody reading books, what happens to them. So it's really, really fascinating point. All right, folks. So this has been an amazing, amazing meetup. This is a topic of deep interest to me. I am really grateful to Phil for introducing Owen Barfield to us. And I really love all the comments and that everybody put forth. It's really a difficult topic to explore, and just by hearing what other people have to say, I think I'm able to learn faster. So I'm really grateful to everybody. So thank you very much, everybody. We'll see you soon. Next, what is coming up next? I don't even remember now. It's too much.
CJ?
Yes, CJ is next, right? Let me see. Okay, CJ is coming up soon. Before that is going to be Mike, I think. So we got 4 people, 4 great meetups on Wednesdays. We got Mike, who does improv, CJ, who does all kinds of topics on epistemology and all kinds of interesting topics, Sanjay, who does neuroscience, and Phil, who has been doing Owen Barfield, but he's an amazingly versatile guy. So I don't know what he's going to do next. We'll find out. We are in the process of, we have finished our meetups on Bhagavad Gita, and we are going to do probably 2 meetups this Thursday, tomorrow, and Friday, looking at the summary of Bhagavad Gita, chapter by chapter. So I think we'll do like half of it Thursday, half of it on Friday. If you're interested in Gita, that would be the best meetups, because it's going to give you like a complete overview of the entire Gita in just 2 meetups. We've, I think, done about close to 100 meetups on Gita. So don't miss that. Of course, we're doing Confucius on Tuesdays, and on Mondays, we are doing poetry, where we are actually trying to use all of this technology of language to try to do collaborative poetry and share the poetry that we like. That's what is going on. So thank you very much, everybody. See you soon. Good night.